I'm really excited to be here, joined by a lot of amazing folks. So my name is Mike Rispoli, he, him pronouns. I'm the Senior Director of Journalism Policy at Free Press. I'm here with Alicia Bell from Borealis Philanthropy, my former colleague and co-conspirator here at Free Press on the News Voices Project. And we're here today to talk about building community power, a newsroom's guide to equitable engagement. I just want to say thank you to the American Journalism Project and Gather for making this webinar possible, and AJP especially for helping us put out this guide that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. So thank you to Laura, to Roshni, to many others at AJP for their support. So we can go to the next slide, Alicia. So what we're going to do today is first, Alicia and I are going to introduce ourselves. We're going to talk a little bit about our work at Free Press when it came to using community organizing to build power in communities to advocate for better local news coverage, and how journalists can also use similar community organizing tactics to build community leaders and to strengthen local reporting. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to have some small group conversations, and then we're going to close and give some resources for folks to follow up with us. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you, Alicia, for handling the slides today. So first things first, make sure you're drinking water. I'm in Philly. It is super hot out today. I don't know where everyone else is, but water is always a good thing. Make sure you're hydrating, taking care of your body, and just generally over the next hour, doing what you need to meet your needs. If you need to go off camera, that's okay. You know, we would encourage folks to come on camera when we do the one-on-one conversations later on, but of course, if you're not comfortable or not able, that's totally fine. So just make sure you're taking care of yourself over the next hour. Like I mentioned before, I'm Mike Rispoli. I'm the Senior Director of Journalism Policy at Free Press. And I'll pass it to Alicia in a second, just letting you know so you don't advance too much, Alicia. But so Alicia and I have known each other for the past 6 years or so, and helped or worked at Free Press. I still currently do. Alicia has since moved on to Borealis, but our work over the past 6 or so years has been really about thinking how are we using community organizing in places that are underserved by local news, and how can journalists use similar tactics to help not only strengthen their journalism, but also do their engagement in a more equitable way, and how their journalism and their engagement practices also build community strength and power. And so we've had the fortune of being able to do this for many years, and we're excited to share a little bit today about what we've learned. I'll pass it to Alicia real quick to introduce themselves.
Hey all, my name is Alicia. I am based in Charlotte, North Carolina. All of the things that Mike said are true. We have definitely worked together. You know, I think moving from, I tell people sometimes that I went to the School of News Voices Journalism, or School of Journalism at News Voices, because prior to this work around organizing communities for news and local news, I wasn't even really sure that journalism mattered or that news meant a thing to people. And through this work, it has really kind of transformed the way that I show up in community, but also the things that I hear back and the things that get lifted up, and also the importance of weaving together these different community spaces. So I'm excited to be here. It's been a wild ride, but you know, we're here now, and I'm excited for this webinar.
Cool, thanks, Alicia. So a little bit about, oh, there's a great picture of Alicia and I many years ago working together. As you can see, I'm looking on in amazement into what Alicia's saying. Alicia's looking at me with, you know, rightful skepticism, probably what I'm saying in that picture. So we can go to the next slide, Alicia. So Free Press is an organization that fights for the public's right to connect and communicate. It was, can you go to the next slide, Alicia? Thank you. It was created to give people a voice in the crucial decisions that shape our media. So Free Press works on a variety of different issues like net neutrality, media ownership, prison phone justice. Alicia and I and our colleague, our other colleague, Alicia Wong-Savson, who's here, we work on a project called News Voices, which was started in 2015 as a way to bring communities into the conversation around the future of local news. We knew that those conversations were happening in many spaces like this, but in a lot of ways, the folks who were most impacted by the decisions that shape our media were not at the table when it came to setting its future. And so what we did was we organized in communities in New Jersey and then North Carolina, in Philadelphia, in Colorado, and many other places to build power to win local media transformations that communities need to thrive. And so what does that mean? And so what we did was we used organizing tactics to co-create collaborative, equitable, and community-centered journalism. And we did that in a variety of different ways. One of the first things we did, and what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is we would host community conversations. We'd bring journalists and non-journalists to meet, to sit down together to talk about ways that local news coverage is thriving, in ways that it's failing, in ways that it can do better. How can we equitably incorporate more diverse voices in our coverage? How are we making sure that our communities are getting the information needs that that they need? And then out of those community conversations, we always would do things like collective visioning, where we brought together a variety of stakeholders, now kind of having that like initial relationship through those conversations, working together to be able to put forward solutions to improve and strengthen local news coverage to make it more community-centered. And with that vision in place, what we helped do is create opportunities to share and build power amongst and with community members and local newsrooms. We helped launch collaborative projects. We would help community members learn media making skills so that they could tell their own stories. We would work with newsrooms on how they can launch different types of projects that don't just kind of like listen to people, but actively co-create and build with them. And as we were doing this work, what we began to kind of better understand, and what Alicia will get into in a minute, is that there's a lot of similarities between community organizing and how journalists do their news gathering and building of sources. But there were also some ways that it was critically different. And the ways in which it was different was what often frayed those relationships. And so what we are going to be talking about today is how journalists can better understand their power and how they impacts the relationships they build with communities, and ways that they can better share that power, not only to make their journalism better, but ultimately to build up community leadership that helps support journalism, but also helps support the community. So Alicia, I'll pass it to you to talk a little bit about what that work looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Before we get into talking about power in journalism, we want to root this conversation and this time together in relationship, because relationship is one of the units we use to measure power, and one of the things that's so key to sustaining power and to growing power across a community. And so what we want to ask y'all to reflect on for about 30 seconds to a minute or so is a relationship that matters to you, a relationship that's meaningful to you. And if you could just drop that, share it in the chat. You don't have to be specific about the person. You could say like a friend of mine or my sister, but also why that relationship is valuable to you. So we're gonna pause for about a minute so folks can think about those relationships and share them and share why they matter to them and why they're meaningful in the chat. And just as folks are thinking about it, I can model an example. So my relationship with Mike is very valuable to me. It's very meaningful to me. And part of the thing I value about our relationship is Mike's willingness to kind of show up with their full selves. I appreciate that they are honest and vulnerable and caring, and willing to share knowledge. And I appreciate that we have a shared love of okra and believe in getting ice cream after dinner instead of going to a bar sometimes. So that's some of the things that I value about my relationship with Mike. I saw someone say they value their relationship with their kids. Mike said they value, ooh, moving fast now, geez. Honesty, open communication, accountability. Folks shared being an effective team and shared values that Vanessa was sharing. They value their relationship with their dad. He's getting older and they want him to be happy. Kat shared, I value my relationship with one of my supervisors because he's very direct, open, and straightforward, makes expectations clear. I admire him. Someone close to me who I trust to tell me when I'm wrong. My parents, I've been showing up differently with them recently, and it's been transforming our connection. I value being able to be more honest than ever with them. So I want to encourage folks to kind of continue dropping these relationships in here and reading what folks are sharing, reading the values of these relationships, and really holding these things nearly and holding these things closely. The reason that we're starting with this relationship, one, I will say, Mike and I have shared this exercise a few times. One of the things that I really appreciate about this kind of reflection is that it's so wholesome and heartwarming to hear about people's relationships and what they value about them. But I think it's also important to ground in this because it's really easy for us to create these kind of dichotomies where we're like, I have personal relationships, but I don't build relationships in my work. Or I have to be really separate or siloed from the relationships that I build in my work. And what I will share is that very rarely, if ever, have we asked this question and folks reflected on it and they've shared a relationship that they valued was a one where someone was not showing up as their full selves. No one has ever said, I really value this relationship because this person doesn't tell me anything and they don't trust me. Never has anyone ever said, I value this relationship because I don't know when to find this person and they're really inaccessible. And so I just ask you to consider these things because those are some of the things that we hear sometimes about journalists. And those are some of the things we hear sometimes about folks who are navigating the practice of journalism when we're in conversation with communities. And so I just encourage you to think about how these qualities of a relationship that you value are things that you can take into your journalism practice, but also, and as an extension of that, your process of power building and community building. So I want to lead with this quote. It's a quote I really like about power that says, power properly understood is the ability to achieve purpose. It's the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic changes. In this sense, power is not only desirable, but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. There is nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. This is a quote by Martin Luther King, and I really appreciate it because I think, I know that we all have a relationship with power. For some of us, we want it, we know we want it, and we want to be powerful. For some of us, we have power, we are powerful, but we don't like to be honest and transparent about the ways in which we are powerful. For some of us, we don't want to be powerful. It's something that feels really gross and icky, and we just don't want to touch that because it's been a really harmful place. And so I like coming back to this quote and this definition of power to hold that it has a neutral connotation, right? It's the ability to achieve purpose. That can be used in a positive fashion, a negative fashion. It can be used to build, it can be used to harm. And so when we kind of expand that out to think about different kinds of power, we want to lift up at least 4 types of power here today. And these are the 4 types of power that we lift up in the guide, which is power over, power with, power to, and power within. So power over is the kind of like coercive, controlling power. It's the one that folks really consider icky, gross, harmful. It's what lies at the core of injustice and oppression. It's used to kind of stoke scarcity or fear. Power with is a horizontal power. So it's a power that is built with relationships, with collaboration, with solidarity. It's the kind of power that creates equity, justice, freedom, and liberation. There's power two, which is the generative power. It allows people to create, to change, to transform. But power two is one of those neutral powers that can either be used in conjunction with power with or used in conjunction with power over. So if you have power over someone, you have the power to oppress them. If you have power with someone, you have the power to create solidarity and equity. And then there's power within. So power within is self-worth, it's knowledge, it's ability. We all uniquely have this power within. What I will say is that not an effort to negate the fact that we have power within, but sometimes folks will say, well, we all have power, or like all communities have power, or all people are powerful, which is true. But that kind of power doesn't need to be and shouldn't be conflated with systemic power, structural power, infrastructural power, community power. Because no matter what kind of power within we have, it does not meet side by side with structural and systemic power. And so at any given issue, in any given moment, in any given movement, oftentimes we'll look at power and understand power as a thing that moves across this chart. So it goes from active opposition to neutral to active support. But what we know is that more often, these are not separate slices, but they are a web of connected relationships. You see this in the ways that people move politically. You see it in the ways that folks move in community. So perhaps you are someone who agrees to something, you're actively kind of supporting it, but you also go to soccer with your kids. And in that soccer team, there is somebody there who actively disagrees. That puts you in a web of connected relationships. And so you have the power to influence that person. You have the power to influence kind of how they move, what they prioritize in your conversations. But it depends on the value and the depth of the relationship. And so that's what we see here, is that oftentimes it doesn't really take much to move people from one side to the other side of the spectrum. It really just takes relationships. And that's a lot easier said than done. It takes a lot of emotional labor to move people. It takes a lot of work to change hearts and minds and hearts and souls. So I don't want to discount that. But I will say it's possible. And we've witnessed that culture change and that shift in this work alone. So that said, one of the ways that we create that horizontal power with each other that moves us closer to equity, moves us closer to communities where everybody gets to thrive, is that we organize. And at its core, organizing is the practice of building sustainable relationships and then catalyzing those relationships towards a shared vision of the future when the opportunities arise or are created. Which means that community organizers are just community residents who are taking on extra tasks to speed up the pace in which we create a new world. I really appreciate one of the things that Cece at Open News, soon at the markup, lifts up when she talks about how it really only takes 2 or 3 people to be organizing. So if you consider you've ever kind of had a vision of having a higher salary, and you've talked to someone else about it to maybe they shared their salary or they shared their tips for negotiating salaries. And then you created an opportunity, or an opportunity arose for you to pitch this new salary, for you to negotiate this new salary. And then you either won it or you lost it. That's an example of organizing, right? So it took these people, the 2 people, the person you talked to, the person maybe you went to a resource, so it was a person that you didn't know, to get some advice, to get some input. You had a target, someone you were trying to move, someone you were trying to shift. You went to them, they had decision-making power. And based on that organizing, based on how that person was able to move based on their values, whether they had shifted, whether they were aligned with yours, then you either won or lost that organizing campaign. And so organizing happens in a lot of ways, and we don't always realize that it's organizing when it's happening. And so some of the overlaps that we know exist between community organizing and journalism are that in all of these spaces, folks are building trust and relationships with people across a community. Folks are uncovering underrepresented stories, lifting up unheard community voices, learning from people most impacted by an issue, sharing information with community members, collaboratively identifying solutions, heightening the impact of reporting, or at least that's what they should be doing, right? So we know that this doesn't always happen, but at its best, this is what journalism should be doing. And at its best, this is what community organizing should be doing as well. So already there's overlaps and parallels between organizing and journalism. And when you break that down into some of the science of what does it take to build leaders, what does it take to build to community leadership, it kind of moves through this cycle. Right? So you're building relationships with people, it's outreach, one-on-one meetings, surveys, you're moving into educating, folks are gaining a deeper knowledge and understanding of an issue, how journalism works, why it's important. Maybe you're visioning and strategizing on work. So what are the stories that folks need uplifted in their community? What are the things that are undercovered? What are the things that are under-resourced? What are the questions that folks have about an institution or a person? And then you take action, right? Oftentimes in journalism, action can look like a story. It can look like creating a product that responds to this visioning and this strategizing. It can look like creating an initiative, creating a set of programs, creating a series of events. And then you evaluate, and then you build it. And the spiral should be growing bigger and bigger every single time you go through this cycle. But when journalism doesn't align with community experiences and those processes aren't happening, then people generally kind of divest. So they turn off the TV, they tune out the radio broadcast, they stop listening to radio, they stop reading the paper. And at its core, that's a divestment. It's not an investment. And generally, if you leave something alone long enough, it'll lose strength, it'll fall apart. And we see this happen far too frequently when it comes to journalism, that when journalism is not aligned with community experiences and community needs, it loses strength and falls apart. Similarly, when we don't have news and information infrastructure that's serving our communities for a long enough time, the community loses strength. And in some ways it does fall apart as well. And so one of the ways we meet this is with engagement. So we have to engage our communities. We have to do that in order to build these relationships, to have these opportunities for education and activation and mobilization. But engagement in and of itself is kind of a neutral thing. And so we have engagement that can be extractive or engagement that can be equitable. If we're organizing to get to a more extractive world, then it makes sense to practice extractive engagement. So this extractive engagement is where a newsroom chooses a story idea or a topic area without any sort of community input, asks the public for help uncovering that story, but you already kind of have the story in your head. You get folks' perspective on it, you report on what you've learned, and then afterwards, you just don't engage with people until you need their ideas again. So again, if you're organizing and your vision of the future is one where we're extracting resources from each other and from the earth and from all communities, then this kind of engagement makes sense. But if you want a future where all people are thriving, if you want a future where folks are informed, where folks have access to democracy, where there's equity, then it might make more sense to practice equitable engagement, which starts with identifying information needs or questions, co-designing, co-creating stories or coverage to meet those needs and answer those questions, and incorporating touch points throughout the news gathering process for continual input and collaboration, and allowing that to be a cycle that keeps on going and doesn't necessarily stop in a linear way. And so what we know is that this engagement and this, when we hold kind of engagement and power together, it moves us towards community ownership, right? So it moves us from ignoring to informing to consulting to involving to collaborating to deferring to. When newsrooms are marginalizing or ignoring communities, then there's no power built. Folks know that their voice, their needs, their interests don't matter. But we can take on this whole spectrum when it comes to community engagement and consider whether our engagement is placating people, whether it's tokenizing people, whether it is giving folks voice, whether it's delegating power, or whether there is actually full community ownership of an entity and institution. And usually when there is community ownership that is resourced, well supported, that community owned infrastructure, community held infrastructure tends to be more sustainable and more long lasting. And so the ways that you do this, and we're going to open up for questions in just a moment. So if folks do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But the ways that folks do this is you look for leadership potential in everyone you encounter. You invest time in folks. You know that they're part of a community. You perceive them and interact with them in holistic ways. And so some ways to get started when you consider like, okay, I've heard you talk about community organizing. I know it's something I could do in journalism. Well, how do I do that? These are some ways to start. So you first can start by mapping out your community. There's a lot of different resources for community mapping. We're not going to go into it in depth here. I would encourage folks to read the guide and to look at some of the other resources that are listed there for that. You reach out, you show up for community members, you acknowledge that people live whole lives, and you follow up. So relationship building, power building is not a one-time thing. It's a process. It takes time. It takes sustaining, especially where there's not a lot of trust and especially where there are a lot of challenges. And so what we see when you do go through that process and when you do invest in folks and invest in their leadership is that as folks can move from participating in something to apprenticing and shadowing someone to conceiving and implementing something with new support, to practicing and iterating, and then to teaching others. And that expands the capacity of our newsrooms and of our journalism and of our news and information infrastructure altogether. So if every single newsroom and every single journalist and every single aspect of the news and information infrastructure, we're building leadership with folks by having them participate in something, having them apprentice or shadow someone, having them conceive and implement something new with support, having folks practice and iterate something, having folks teaching others, the capacity and the reach of our journalism would be so much further and have so much more depth, and the legs would be longer and it would be so much more sustainable. And so I'm going to pass it to Mike to give an example of what this looks like in real time.
Sure. And, like we mentioned at the top, Alicia and I in Free Press have been working with the American Journalism Project for the better part of 2 years. And a lot of the things that we talk about in the sky that we've been talking about on the webinar today, we've been working one-on-one with several of AJP's grantees about implementing these things in their process. And I wanted to just share one example of what that looked like. The Connecticut Mirror is a really incredible nonprofit newsroom based in Connecticut. They do a lot of statewide policy coverage or statewide issues. And so they were interested in doing more work at the local level, meeting not just like with grass tops leaders, but like really kind of getting down to more the grassroots levels. And, as a statewide nonprofit, not necessarily doing community-based work, they weren't totally sure how to do that. And so we worked with them on developing things like outreach plans and community listening and things like that. And one of the things that came out of that process was an interest from folks around the state to have their voices featured more in the CT Mirror. And certainly one way that they could have done doing that was either doing like guest columns or guest op-eds, but we knew that just having people write in to have their op-eds published on the CT Mirror's website wouldn't necessarily go towards building deeper relationships with folks. And so along with my colleague, Alicia Bell, who's here, we worked with CT Mirror to develop a community editorial board where I believe 12 members or 12 non-journalists from across the state of Connecticut from a variety of different backgrounds and communities would sit on an editorial board for a year, produce content for the site, but would also be trained in various forms of writing and media making so that they were also learning skills around journalism that they could use beyond their time on the editorial board, and they were compensated for their time and the production of content. And I think what's really interesting about this is that if you kind of in your mind, or if you go to the guide, that process that Alicia was describing, you know, a lot of times that first step in that cycle is building relationships. And a lot of times that's kind of where journalists stop. They build relationships with people, they get information, and then they publish it. If you look at what CT Mirror does, they built relationships with people, and then with them visioned out, like, what would a community editorial board look like? What would it do? What would the impact be? How would we compensate people? So they kind of, with members of the public and other journalists, kind of co-created this idea, and then they implemented it. And that process of people joining that not only allows for them to reach different people across the state that maybe they weren't reaching before, but it's also building the leadership of these 12 individuals to create and make media and to have their voices heard and to be paid for it. And so it looks different when you do this type of engagement versus just kind of like the normal or more like kind of like historical ways that newsrooms would do sourcing or engagement, or even things like guest op-ed. To create, the whole process is different, but both the newsroom and the communities that they're serving are better at the other end of it. And so we wanted to share that one example of one way that looks like, one way that looks. So I think, you know, we didn't have too many questions in the chat other than just like, can we share the slides? Yes, we will share the slides and the guide afterwards. I know Kat had one question about like, what do community touch points look like? I dropped in some things in there. I would also point you to another guide that Free Press wrote. One was don't just engage, organize. And there's also another one called Tactics for Transforming Local News that include a variety of different tactics that journalists and non-journalists can use to get a better sense of people's community information needs. We'll share those in the chat as well as afterwards. And so because, you know, we don't have a ton of time, but we wanted people to be able to, you know, to share and meet other folks who are on this call, we're just going to break off for the next 10 minutes or so just to do one-on-one conversations. Alicia, if you could go to the next slide. Certainly, folks, you could talk about whatever you want to talk about. We hope it's about, you know, this conversation that we're having, but we also want to encourage folks to kind of share just, you know, what is this sparking in you? What feels exciting or uncertain about these types of tactics or kind of processes? And just some other guiding questions in case like you need some, you know, kind of help getting the conversation started. We'll drop all of these in there. Thank you, Alicia, for doing that. And so what we would just encourage people to do is, you know, we're going to break you off into groups of 2, introduce yourselves, pronouns, affiliations, anything else that you want to do to share about, you know, about yourself. And then for the next 10 minutes, just talk about, you know, either anything that's kind of sparked for you from listening to this today, but also like if you're interested in talking more kind of about what this looks like in your newsroom, what kind of culture are you trying to build? How can you intentionally practice power building with your community? How do you cultivate leadership? You can share ideas or examples or challenges. We just really want to encourage folks to kind of dig into this material and kind of think out loud and to discuss with someone else different ideas that this might be sparking for you. Okay, cool. Well, welcome back, everyone. You know, we always try to make time for folks to have conversations with others, because there's so many people here who have a tremendous amount of knowledge. It's not just Alicia and I, even though we're at the front of the room in the beginning. We always want to make sure that we have time for folks to connect with people. Those conversations are never as long as we would like them to be. And we have maybe about like 7 minutes or so. If there's any questions or comments that people have, either questions that came up during the presentation, questions that or comments that came up during your one-on-ones. If you're on Zoom, you can just use like your raise hand feature and we'll call on you. If for whatever reason you're not able to do that, just drop something in the chat to let us know that you'd like to ask a question. But we have about 7 minutes or so. Rhiannon, let's see, you have your hand up.
Thanks, go ahead. Yeah. Hi, I was wondering, when you were talking about the community editorial boards, How do you recruit people for that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So the one thing I forgot to mention at the top is that CT Mirror, like we did like a lot of research into the use of community editorial boards and different newsrooms across the country. And there were only 2 that we found besides CT Mirror that were doing something similar in this way. And so, so the way I share that, because the recruitment that those different editorial boards did were different. Well, what CT Mirror did was they created like an outreach list and did and just like connected with various folks across the state to see, one, if like they were interested in joining, but also like, hey, like, can you recommend someone to join this? Maybe someone who doesn't normally write guest op-eds or isn't necessarily the leader of a nonprofit or whatever it might be. And so that's like certainly one way. So like utilizing your existing networks to reach out to new folks. And they also did like an online form where people could nominate someone or nominate themselves to join. And these are for year-long positions. So there were a number of folks who would have been really interesting to join, but just for one reason or another didn't this year. But then you have like a bank of people that you can reach out to next year. And so those were some of the ways that we were seeing recruitment being done. Yeah, and I see that is it Genia from Canopy Atlanta. Canopy Atlanta is an awesome news organization. If y'all aren't familiar with Canopy in Atlanta, you should definitely check them out. I did not know that you use community editorial boards, so that's really great to hear that you're utilizing that project. It's such a cool process. And thanks for lifting that up. Do other folks have questions or comments that they want to raise up before we close today? We probably have time for like 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, I appreciate you lifting that up. I mean, I think there's a lot of exchange, especially between participatory action research and this kind of engaged equitable and journalism engagement that we're talking about, where it is so rooted in kind of what our community needs, and then how do we make sure that what folks, the research that comes out is useful and utilizable by communities. So there's absolutely a lot of links there.
Right. That's great.
Thank you. And I saw a question in the chat from Kat. What is your advice on reaching out to potential audiences and contributors who do manual labor? And I'm not sure if you meant what kind of manual labor you meant, but I will say, you know, for folks who range from doing kind of construction work, from folks who are maybe garbage truck drivers, or whether it's like folks who work in mechanic shops or things like that, or folks who are working as cashiers or baristas or fast food workers. I think it's really important, one, to think about the timing that you're inviting folks into, whether it's in conversations, whether it's in events, whether it's in gatherings, to think about where folks are. 2, I think it's really important to consider how, especially for editorial boards where you're asking folks to produce labor, to think about how folks may be compensated for that, because that's a way of meeting community need and meeting individual need, and allows folks to show up in different ways. I think sometimes folks will provide stipends, sometimes folks will provide meals, will provide bus passes, will provide gas cards, different things like that to make it easier for folks to show up. Then the other piece I'll say is that, honestly, I believe that like folks who are in a lot of, especially like manual service roles, have the dirt on everything and everybody. Like the things that like cashiers over here, the things that like servers at restaurants know, the things that baristas know, the things that custodial staff know, and the questions that they have are usually some of the best rooted material for kind of figuring out stories, bringing people into process. And so I think even if it's not through a formal shape, like an editorial board or like an engagement series or like whatever that thing is, building those relationships and valuing folks and showing up and in your community is a really important way to bring folks into your work. It doesn't always have to be in a formal shape. Oftentimes it happens just in the relationships we build and the ways that we move through our cities and our communities.
Yeah, and one thing I would add there before we close, and I know we're at time, is that like typically, like as a journalist, right, like your source list is the reason why you're even able to do your reporting. And so I would look at like your existing source lists or the typical ways that you reach out for people to quote for stories, and those are typically like grasstops leaders, typically. And I would consider meeting with them and talking to them about how you can better connect with their members or their constituents or the people that they organize with. So utilizing your existing networks to then kind of reach deeper and deeper into communities or to find folks who normally aren't interviewed or heard from when it comes to local news coverage is the way that we do. And that's just kind of like a way to kind of move from the grass tops deeper and deeper down to the grassroots level. Utilizing relationships, always asking people to connect to you, and you're able to make those asks because you hopefully have strong enough relationships with these folks where you could ask those questions and that they're willing to vouch for you to connect them with people that normally you wouldn't necessarily be connected to. Cool. Well, we're at time, and so what we're going to do is first thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you for the work you do. Whether it's in journalism or not, thank you for your interest in this. And certainly thank you to American Journalism Project and Gather for making this talk happen today. We will share around the slides as well as a copy of this report and maybe some other guides that we mentioned. And you've got Alicia's name up there, Alicia's email up there, my email up there. If you want to reach out to Free Press's News Voices Project, who might be able to kind of help your newsroom or at the very least like share perspectives or resources, you can email them at newsvoices@freepress.net.
And Vanessa from News Voices just dropped her email in the chat as well.
Yes,
so if folks need that, it's there.
Yep. Thank you, Vanessa. Shout out to Vanessa, who leads the News Voices Project and has been doing amazing work there. So definitely reach out to Vanessa for more. Thank you so much, everyone. We hope you have a good day and we hope you stay in touch. Take care.
Thanks, Cheryl.